They didn't say it outright. Not at first. They said things like, "You're a great fit, just not this time." They said, "You're really articulate," like it was a surprise. They said, "You should try something else, something more realistic." And when they did say it, really say it, it was in a whisper, in a back room, in a hallway, in a moment they thought I wouldn't remember. "You're too black for this industry." I was 17. I didn't cry. I just stood there, silent, small, and memorized every syllable. And now, years later, they walk into my office with a resume and a forced smile. And I smile back, because I remember. But this story, it's not about revenge. It's about what happens when the kid they said wouldn't make it becomes the one holding the door open. They never yelled it, never carved it into stone or printed it in bold. No, the first time I was told I wouldn't make it, not really, it came as a whisper. A brush of the wind between expectations and reality. A subtle shrug from a teacher. A raised eyebrow in the guidance counselor's office. It was the silence in the room when I said I wanted to study business. It was the way my name, Deshawn, made the room pause for a split second longer than anyone else's on the attendance list. I grew up in a town that liked to think it was tolerant. That word, tolerant, always felt like an insult dressed as a compliment. Like they were saying, "We're okay with you being here, as long as you don't make too much noise." And I didn't at first. I was the quiet kid, the polite one, the one who made straight A's and got called exceptional. As though black excellence were a rare anomaly rather than a reflection of what happens when someone refuses to let the world shrink them. I remember in 3rd grade, I raised my hand to answer a question about economics. The substitute teacher looked around the room, hesitated, and said, "Let's give someone else a chance." She called on Emma, who had been coloring in her notebook. I told myself maybe I had spoken too much that day, that maybe she just hadn't seen me. I made excuses for her, the way children often do when the truth hurts more than the lie. In 6th grade, I asked if I could join the accelerated math track. My teacher smiled, a tight, pinched kind of smile, and said, "Are you sure? It's very fast-paced." I said yes. She didn't hand me the form. The whisper wasn't always audible, but it was always there, slipping beneath my skin, coiling around my sense of possibility. By the time I reached high school, I had learned how to code switch fluently. I wore my ambition carefully, like a tie that was always one notch too tight. I knew how to make my voice sound safe, how to sit with my back straight, my hands visible, my gaze respectful but never challenging. I knew what was expected of me, to be impressive but not intimidating, grateful but not too proud, hungry but never entitled. I still remember the first time I said out loud that I wanted to own my own company. I was 17 in an after-school mentorship program. We were doing mock interviews and I told my assigned mentor, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and that practiced kind of charisma you only find in corporate boardrooms, that I dreamed of building something from the ground up. A consulting firm, maybe even a venture capital fund for underserved communities. He chuckled. It wasn't cruel, just dismissive. "You've got drive," he said. "But don't try to run before you can walk. Focus on getting a job first. A good one. Then maybe you can think about bigger things. Don't aim too high too fast. Okay?" I nodded, smiled, said thank you, and inside me, something small and bright cracked. Not because he told me I couldn't, but because he didn't even believe I should. But that wasn't the worst one. No, the one that stayed, the one that never left, happened later that year. I had just finished giving a pitch at a local youth entrepreneurship event. I had prepared for weeks. Every slide, every stat, every answer rehearsed down to the syllable. I wore my only blazer, ironed 3 times, and borrowed my cousin's shoes because they looked more professional. I finished my pitch. People clapped. Some even stood. One of the judges, a woman with years of business accolades under her belt, asked a few pointed questions. I nailed them. I saw heads nod. I felt the air shift. And then, when it was over, I overheard her in the hallway as I walked past to use the restroom. She didn't know I was behind her. Didn't know I heard every word. "That kid? He's good. But let's be honest, he's too black for the boardroom. That energy won't translate." I froze. Not out of fear but clarity. That's when I understood. This wasn't about my slides, my GPA, my posture, my diction. It was about my skin. It was about everything I couldn't scrub out or soften or sell in a resume. I walked into the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My reflection didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even breathe for a full 10 seconds. I just stared. And then I whispered it back to myself, almost as if to see how it felt in my own mouth. You're too black to succeed. I said it again and again, until the words stopped sounding like prophecy and started sounding like fuel. That whisper, that casual, cruel sentence thrown out like gum under a desk, became the fire beneath my feet. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't write a social media post calling it out. I didn't organize a protest or ask for an apology. I just carried it, like an ember tucked into my chest, quiet and burning. The truth is, I think every black kid has their version of that moment. The time they realized the rules were different for them. That talent might open the door, but perception held the key. That no matter how polished, poised, or safe they became, there would always be rooms where they'd still be seen as a threat, or worse, a charity case. It took me years to understand what that whisper really meant. It didn't mean I couldn't succeed. It meant they had already decided what success looked like. And I wasn't it. But I had other plans. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life trying to fit into rooms that had been built to exclude me. I wasn't going to bleach my ambition or shrink my vision to make them feel comfortable. If they thought I didn't belong at the table, fine. I'd build my own. And someday they'd be the ones asking for a seat. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, I had to survive the silence. The no calls back. The ghosting after interviews. The polite rejection emails with no feedback. I had to sit through meetings where my ideas were too aggressive. I had to watch less qualified peers get promoted because they fit the culture. I had to bite my tongue when I was told I was a bit much. I had to endure networking events where I was mistaken for waitstaff. I had to smile when a partner at a firm told me I was so articulate, as if he expected otherwise. And through it all, I remembered that hallway, that woman's voice, that whisper that never left. I don't remember the first time I realized I was different. Not just in appearance, but in expectation. Not just in skin, but in space. It wasn't a single moment. It was an accumulation, a slow layering of small exclusions, polite corrections, and unsaid rules that seemed to orbit around me like invisible walls. The kind that don't push you, but gently confine you, guiding you where they think you belong. I was the only black kid in my class until I was 10. And even when another black student transferred in, people kept confusing us for each other, despite looking nothing alike. I remember once in the 3rd grade, Michael, that was his name, got caught talking during a test, and the teacher looked right at me and said, "That's your last warning." I didn't even correct her. I just nodded and put my head down. Felt easier that way. In those early years, school wasn't just about learning math or history. It was about learning how to exist, how to move through hallways without drawing too much attention, how to raise your hand just enough to seem engaged, but not enough to seem like you're showing off, how to smile when someone touched your hair without permission, how to laugh along when they made jokes about fried chicken or rap lyrics or asked if your dad was around, always with that sideways grin like it was just harmless curiosity. What they never understood was that every interaction came with calculation. I couldn't just be. I had to manage, curate, perform. Even as a child, I started wearing my backpack higher, tidier, to match the kids whose parents were doctors and real estate agents. I asked my mom to buy me khakis instead of jeans because that's what Ryan and Ethan wore, and teachers seemed to like them more. I stopped using slang even when I was with friends who understood it. I enunciated every syllable, practiced in front of the mirror until my voice lost any edge that might make someone lean away instead of lean in. It wasn't about shame. It was about safety and access. But no matter how carefully I adjusted the mask, I was always reminded that I didn't quite fit. In 7th grade, during a group project, one of the girls in my class leaned over and said, "You're not like other black guys. You're really smart." She smiled when she said it, as if it were a compliment. as if I should be flattered by her surprise. That's the thing about growing up in a space you were never meant to thrive in. They don't always want to destroy you. Sometimes they want to display you, frame you as an exception, a reason not to change the system. See? He made it. Why can't the rest of them? But even that status is fragile. Conditional. One misstep, one misquote, one moment of frustration too visible, and you go from inspiration to problem in the blink of an eye. In high school, I joined student government. Not because I loved politics, but because I knew it looked good on college applications. I was the only black student on the council. During one meeting, I suggested organizing a fundraiser for a local nonprofit that supported inner-city youth. One of the other students, a boy who wore Vineyard Vines polos and spoke with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, rolled his eyes and said, "Of course you'd suggest that." Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But later that night, I stared at the ceiling for hours, trying to understand why I felt like I'd swallowed a stone. I tried joining debate. Got told I was too aggressive in my delivery. I tried choir. Was always assigned the upbeat solos, never the ballads. I tried cross-country. Got benched during regionals to give others a chance. No matter what I did, there was always a ceiling, a script, a shadow. Even the guidance counselor, the one person who was supposed to believe in us, once told me to apply to state colleges just to be realistic, despite my grades being nearly perfect. I remember asking her about a scholarship for minority students. She said, "You don't want to be that guy, do you?" I wasn't sure what she meant. I still don't know. But I nodded anyway. What no one told me growing up was that you could be excellent and invisible at the same time. That you could follow all the rules, wear the right clothes, say the right words, and still be seen through a filter of doubt. Not because of who you are, but because of what you look like. Because someone decided long before you ever arrived that your skin meant something else. I remember visiting a friend's house after school. A beautiful home with marble countertops and walls covered in framed degrees. His father shook my hand and smiled tightly. Later, I overheard him asking his son, "Does he know his dad?" My friend stammered and changed the subject. I pretended not to hear. But that night, when I got home, I hugged my father harder than usual. Strange, the things that stay with you. Not the big moments, but the quiet humiliations. The jokes you're not supposed to take personally. The compliments laced with condescension. The invitations that never come. The recognition that only arrives when it's convenient, or when they want to prove that they do have black friends. But here's the thing. All of it, the isolation, the hypervisibility, the internal war between pride and pressure, it didn't kill my ambition. Clarified it. I didn't want to belong in spite of my blackness. I wanted to belong as I was. Fully. Authentically. Loud if I chose to be. Brilliant when I had something to say. Flawed because I was human, not because I was one of the good ones. I started reading about people who built their own paths. Entrepreneurs, activists, community builders. I became obsessed with stories of black excellence. Not just in entertainment or sports, but in boardrooms, classrooms, and kitchen tables turned into strategy hubs. I saw what they had done, with less, with worse odds, with the same whispers, and I felt something shift. I didn't want to be the exception. I wanted to be the evidence. The proof that we didn't need permission to exist in power. That we didn't need to ask to be respected. That we didn't have to wait for the system to catch up in order to lead. We could create. We could organize. We could thrive. Not because we were allowed, but because we were called. Still, it would take years for that conviction to become action. For that spark to become blueprint. Because knowing you want to build something is one thing. Believing you can is another. And for a long time, I still didn't. I still thought I had to wait for someone else to invite me, to vouch for me, to give me a shot, to pull me up from the outside. It wasn't until everything fell apart, until I realized the rooms I was trying to enter would never be designed with me in mind, that I began to ask a different question. What if I stopped knocking on their doors and started building my own? But that's for the next part of the story. This chapter, this foundation, is the truth I had to live through first. That the world wasn't built for me to belong. But I was never built to beg for belonging. I was built to create it. And so I would. Not every rejection makes a sound. Some doors don't slam shut in your face. They close slowly, without even the dignity of a goodbye. They creak shut behind polite smiles and HR-approved phrases. They click softly through silence, no reply, no call back, no reason given. And you're left standing in front of a hallway full of doors that all looked open until you got close enough to knock. That was the story of my 20s. After college, I did everything right. Honors program, internships every summer. I wore the navy suit, the brown shoes, the same damn tie every interviewee seemed to wear because we all thought there was a uniform for being taken seriously. I learned to answer questions in ways that showed initiative but not arrogance, confidence but not ego. I learned to recite just enough of the company's mission statement to sound passionate, but never rehearsed. And yet, time after time, rejection. Some were instant. Some took weeks. Some were so long and drawn out I started wondering if they had forgotten me entirely. Only to receive the templated, "We regret to inform you," email at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. The worst ones were the interviews that felt like they'd gone well. The ones where they shook your hand just a little longer, where someone told you, "Honestly, you remind me of myself when I was your age." The ones where you walked out with your shoulders a little straighter, thinking, this time, maybe this time. But then the phone never rang. And your inbox stayed empty. Sometimes I'd go back and reread the job posting, just to torture myself. I'd reanalyze every word of the interview. Did I talk too much? Did I sound too eager? Did I say something wrong when I mentioned where I was from? But deep down, I knew. Most of the time, I wasn't being rejected because I wasn't good enough. I was being rejected because I didn't feel like a fit. Fit. That invisible word that moves like smoke through hiring rooms. It sounds innocent, neutral, harmless, but fit is often just code for comfort. And comfort in corporate America often means familiarity. And familiarity almost never looks like me. There was one job, a junior analyst position at a mid-sized firm. I nailed the first interview. Second round? Even better. The hiring manager told me, "You're sharp. You've got a great presence." I walked out practically glowing. They said they'd be in touch. A week passed. Then two. I followed up. No answer. Then, by accident, I saw the job reposted. Same title. Same responsibilities. Same salary. And I knew. They hadn't just rejected me. They'd erased me. Not because I couldn't do the job, but because they never really saw me in the chair to begin with. That's the kind of rejection that doesn't scream. It lingers. It starts to creep in during the in-between moments. When you're tying your tie in the morning. When you rehearse your introduction on the subway. When you shake another hand and wonder if they're seeing you, or just everything they assume you represent. There were also the jobs I got, and then realized I was never meant to keep. One of my first full-time roles was at a consulting firm. I came in early, stayed late, asked questions, took notes. I was eager, maybe too eager. I remember once, during a brainstorming meeting, I pitched an idea that would streamline a client's onboarding process. The room went quiet. No one responded. A senior associate cleared his throat and moved on. 2 days later, that same associate emailed the team, pitching my exact idea with 2 words changed. No credit.
No mention.
Nothing. I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't care, but because I already knew how that story ended. You complain, and you're difficult. You speak up, and you're disruptive. You push back, and you're not a team player. So I let it go, or at least I pretended to, but the resentment stayed. It was the same place where I got passed over for promotion in my second year, despite outperforming everyone in my cohort. I asked for feedback. They told me I needed to work on my executive presence. I asked what that meant. They couldn't explain. But I knew. It meant something about me still made them uncomfortable in leadership. Not my skills. Not my results. Me. It was in the way people looked surprised when I presented to clients. It was the way someone always commented on my energy, never quite explaining if they meant it as praise or concern. It was the way they laughed too hard at my jokes in the break room, like they were trying to signal something they didn't know how to say. Eventually, I left. I told them I was going to pursue other opportunities. That was the polite thing to say. But the truth was, I was tired of performing gratitude for a space that had no intention of growing with me. I tried again. Another firm, a nonprofit, a startup. Each time, a new mask, a new strategy, a new version of myself crafted to ease their discomfort. And each time, the same result, inclusion with conditions. I was welcomed, as long as I didn't challenge. As long as I didn't question why the only people in leadership looked the same. As long as I didn't notice the jokes made behind closed doors. As long as I didn't talk too much about representation or community or bias. As long as I played along. But playing along started to cost more than it paid. There was one afternoon I'll never forget. I was walking back from lunch, and a colleague from another department stopped me. He smiled, that sharp, knowing kind of smile, and said, "Man, you must be used to this. You've probably had to hustle your whole life." It wasn't a question. It was a framing. In that moment, I wasn't a professional. I wasn't a colleague. I was a narrative, an archetype. His idea of who I was, shaped by movies and stereotypes and maybe one too many rap lyrics. I nodded, gave a half smile, walked away, and then I sat at my desk, opened a blank document, and couldn't write a single word, because I realized I wasn't tired from the work. I was tired from the proving, from having to earn my place in rooms where others arrived pre-validated, from trying to be the right amount of black, not too loud, not too proud, not too visible, from pretending that being included was the same as being valued. And so, quietly, I began to question everything. Why was I still asking for permission? Why was I still shrinking myself to fit inside structures that were never built with me in mind? Why was I still trying to win the approval of people who saw my existence as a footnote, not a force? And what would happen if I stopped? What would happen if I built something of my own? Something where people like me didn't have to code switch to survive. That thought was small at first, a flicker, but it grew, because I had spent enough time in rooms that echoed with polite rejection, with vague explanations, with silences that spoke louder than any word, and I had heard enough doors close behind me. I was ready to build a place where no one else had to wonder if the problem was them, or just the design of the hallway. You don't always notice the moment something inside you breaks. Sometimes it isn't loud. It doesn't happen in a dramatic confrontation or an explosion of anger. Sometimes it happens on a Tuesday. Sometimes it happens in an elevator. Sometimes it happens in a silence so thick and familiar that you almost miss it. For me, it happened in a parking lot. I had just walked out of yet another meeting where I had said too little or maybe too much. I was never quite sure anymore. I sat through 45 minutes of tight smiles, vague nods, and a new consultant repeating the very ideas I'd emailed 2 weeks earlier. No one seemed to remember. Or maybe they did and just didn't care to say it out loud. That's almost worse, somehow. Being seen. But only when it's convenient to ignore you. I walked out into the sun, jacket slung over my shoulder, heart heavier than it had any right to be. And I just stood there, right next to my car. Not moving, not breathing, just still. I wasn't angry. Not really. I wasn't even sad. I was something more dangerous. I was numb. That's when I knew I had to make a decision. Because numbness, for someone like me, doesn't come without a cost. It's a warning sign, a signal that the fire is being buried. And when the fire dies, so does the part of you that still dares to believe things can change. I couldn't let that happen. I remembered something my grandfather used to say when I was a boy. He had worked as a janitor for over 40 years. The kind of work that left his knees swollen and his hands calloused. But he never spoke of it with bitterness. He used to say, "If they won't let you in the house, boy, you build your own. Just make sure there's room for others when you do." At the time, I thought he meant pride, dignity, manhood. But now I realize he meant agency. He meant ownership. He meant refusing to keep asking for scraps when you're capable of preparing the meal. So that night, I pulled out a notebook I hadn't opened in years. The same one I'd used back in college when I was still dreaming, before I knew how heavy dreaming could feel. I flipped through old notes, sketches of business models, scribbled quotes from books and podcasts and mentors I'd never met. And slowly, That flicker returned. The fire. Not the fire of revenge. Not a desire to prove anyone wrong. But something deeper, the need to prove something right. To prove that belonging doesn't have to come with conditions. That success doesn't have to be sanitized. That leadership doesn't need to look one way, speak one way, move one way. That maybe, just maybe, someone like me could build something not in reaction to rejection, but in response to vision. The first step wasn't glamorous. It was Googling how to file an LLC. It was sending emails to old professors, asking if they'd be willing to read a business plan. It was rewatching TED Talks and writing down every question they never answered. It was making a spreadsheet of all the people who had once told me, "Let me know if I can help," and actually testing whether they meant it. It was humbling, quiet, sometimes terrifying, and I did it all while still working my full-time job. Because bills don't care about dreams. I'd spend 9 hours pretending to be okay in a system that constantly asked me to dilute myself, and then come home and pour every ounce of who I really was into building something that didn't yet exist. I worked in silence, not because I was hiding, but because I had learned that most people don't support visions they can't yet understand. And I was tired of having to defend the seed before it had sprouted. So I built, one night at a time, one idea at a time, one tiny step at a time. And the more I built, the more I remembered the things the world had tried to make me forget. My own power, my own voice, my right to take up space. I began reading not just about business, but about healing, about ecosystems, about justice. I wasn't just interested in building a company. I wanted to build a culture, a space where no one would ever have to wonder if they were too anything to lead. Too black, too queer, too outspoken, too quiet, too much, because I had been told all of those things, and I had survived them. I didn't want survival to be the ceiling anymore. I wanted freedom to be the floor. That fire kept me going. On the nights when the imposter syndrome screamed. On the mornings when the bank rejected my application for a loan. On the days when I saw someone from my past get praised for a project I knew they'd only been handed because of connections I never had. On the Sundays when I thought maybe I am too much, but the fire never died. Dimmed, flickered, but it never went out. It lived in every memory of being talked over. Every time I was told I was too intense. Every time a job interviewer looked surprised when I spoke with clarity and strategy. Every time someone said, "Wow, you're not like the others." Every time I saw another headline about someone who looked like me being murdered, silenced, erased. The fire lived in my refusal to become what the world expected me to become. Small, bitter, silent. It lived in my decision to create. And slowly, something began to shift. I started consulting quietly at first. Small clients, local nonprofits, startups led by other people of color who just needed someone to believe in their idea the way no one had believed in mine. And then momentum. One referral became two. Two became four. The work was messy, raw, beautiful. It didn't look like the firms I had once applied to, but it looked like home. It looked like possibility. It looked like legacy. I remember sitting in a coffee shop with a client. She was launching a wellness brand for Black women and needed strategy help. She said, "You get it. You speak the language. You see me." And I thought, this is why the fire matters. Not because it made me strong, but because it kept me soft, attuned, open. The fire didn't just fuel my ambition. It shaped my empathy. Because when you've spent your whole life being denied space, you become an expert in how to create it for others. And that's exactly what I was learning to do. Not alone, not perfectly, but with purpose. That fire, the one they tried to bury under rejection and polite dismissals, it became my blueprint. And I made myself a promise. One day I'd build a team, a real one. And when I did, I'd remember everyone who had been told, "You don't belong." And I'd make sure they knew, not only do you belong, you lead here. But first I had to build the foundation, because nothing great gets built without fire. And thank God, they gave me so much to burn. Starting something from scratch is never just about the idea. Ideas are easy, romantic, clean. The reality is always messy, full of late nights, silent bank accounts, and moments where the belief in what you're building is the only thing louder than the fear that it might not work. I began with a single client and a borrowed laptop. No office, no employees, no logo. Just me, a Google Doc, and an idea too persistent to ignore. I called it Anchor Strategies, not because I was trying to sound sophisticated, but because I knew what it felt like to drift. I wanted to build something that helped people like me stop drifting. Professionally, emotionally, socially. Something rooted. Something steady. Something that reminded folks they could belong without erasing themselves. But belief doesn't pay invoices, and vision doesn't guarantee rent. So I hustled. I worked out of coffee shops and on friends' couches. I took gigs others would turn down. I helped small businesses find their voice, rebuild their websites, clarify their mission. Most of them couldn't pay much. A few couldn't pay anything. But they believed in what I was building because it spoke to what they had lived. I worked with a Latina single mom launching her own wellness line. A formerly incarcerated black man who had learned coding in prison and wanted to start a tech repair shop. A queer couple trying to turn their pop-up bakery into a storefront. None of them had the right pedigree. None of them had institutional support. But all of them had fire. And fire recognizes fire. Every time we sat down to talk business, it always turned into something more. Conversations about self-worth. Shame. Navigating rooms that were never built for us. I'd finish a brand strategy session and end up giving someone advice on how to pitch without shrinking. Or how to ask for more without apologizing. We were talking business, but really we were rebuilding belief. That's when I realized what I was actually doing. I wasn't just offering services. I was offering space. The kind of space I had begged for in boardrooms. The kind of space that never existed for me in job interviews. The kind of space where excellence wasn't defined by proximity to whiteness or wealth, but by the clarity of one's conviction. Where experience wasn't just resumes, it was resilience. And slowly, brick by broken brick, it began to take shape. The first real milestone came 6 months in. I landed a contract with a nonprofit focused on educational equity. It wasn't massive, but it was enough for me to breathe just a little. Enough to stop rationing gas money. Enough to buy a decent chair instead of working from the floor. Enough to invest in proper branding and hire a freelance designer. A young black woman who had been ghosted by every agency she applied to and was about to give up. I couldn't offer her benefits. I couldn't offer her stability. But I could offer her a door. And she walked through it like she had always owned the room. From there, we grew. I brought on a project manager. A quiet, sharp-as-glass introvert who had been passed over for management roles because he wasn't assertive enough. What they meant was he didn't play politics. I didn't want politics. I wanted precision. And he delivered. Then came interns. Then contractors. Then an office space we shared with a community organization. A converted garage with peeling paint and more heart than most skyscrapers. It wasn't flashy, but it was ours. We filled that space with ideas, laughter, frustrations, and hope. We wrote mission statements by hand. We cried over rejections. We celebrated every small win like it was a Fortune 500 contract. And every time someone asked what made us different, I'd say, we don't hire for culture fit. We hire for culture rebirth. Because this wasn't just about making a living. It was about remaking the rules. But make no mistake, it wasn't easy. There were months when payroll came down to the wire. Days when I questioned whether I was failing everyone who believed in me. Moments when clients ghosted, grants fell through, and team members burned out. There were nights when I couldn't sleep because I didn't know how we'd survive the next quarter. There were partnerships I had to walk away from, not because we couldn't benefit from them, but because the cost to our values was too high. And yet, through every setback, I kept building. Because every broken brick taught me something. Every wrong turn clarified the map. Every slammed door made the ones we opened that much more sacred. One of the hardest lessons came the day I had to let someone go. He was one of my first hires, a brilliant guy with a sharp eye for design but a habit of speaking over others in meetings, especially women. We talked, coached, I set boundaries, but he didn't change. And eventually I had to make a decision. Not for me, for the culture we were trying to build. When I let him go, he said, "You're really going to let this social justice stuff cost you your best designer?" I looked him in the eye and said, "If I don't, then this isn't justice. It's marketing." That was the day I stopped flinching at the weight of leadership. Because leadership isn't about being liked. It's about being clear. And clarity, I learned, was my compass. It guided every decision, from the clients we took on to the language we used in our contracts. From how we showed up in community meetings to how we handled mistakes. We weren't perfect, but we were present. And that mattered. 1 year in, we held our first team retreat. It wasn't at a resort. It was in a borrowed room at a local library. We sat in a circle, passed around a box of donuts, and shared our why. Most people cried. All of us laughed. And for the first time, I looked around a room full of people who weren't just surviving a system. We were building something beyond it. That's when I knew this was real. Not because of revenue, not because of scale, but because of impact. Because every brick we laid came from something broken, and we didn't pretend otherwise. We used the cracks. We honored the struggle. And in doing so, we built something solid. Something sacred. Anchor Strategies was no longer a dream. It was a structure. And inside it, lives were shifting. A client once told me, "You didn't just help me build a business. You reminded me that I matter." That's it. That's the thing. Because when you've spent your life trying to convince people you belong, sometimes the most revolutionary act is to create a space where others no longer have to. We weren't just consultants. We were rebuilders. Of confidence. Of dignity. Of what business could look like when it's led by people who've known what it feels like to be told they never should have made it this far. Brick by broken brick, we were making room. And we weren't done yet. It didn't happen all at once.
No cinematic revenge montage.
No headline in a newspaper. No parade through the streets. That's the thing about real power, it doesn't arrive with applause. It settles in quietly, like dust on furniture. And then one day you sit back in your chair, exhale, and realize, this is the seat they said I'd never occupy. By year 3, Anchor Strategies wasn't just surviving, it was defining something. We'd moved into a bigger space. A renovated brick building with creaky floors and huge windows. Sunlight poured in like grace, warming the concrete we once couldn't afford to polish. We had 12 full-time employees and a waiting list of interns. Our projects were getting national attention, not because of who we knew, but because of how we showed up. We had become a refuge for voices the industry never knew how to hear. A proving ground for people who didn't need to be saved, just seen. And then it started. At first it was subtle. A familiar name in an email inquiry. A resume that jogged a memory. A LinkedIn message from someone who had once dodged mine. And then, unmistakably, it was them. The same hiring managers. The same colleagues. The same gatekeepers who had shut me out, talked over me, dismissed me, forgotten me. They were applying for jobs at my company. One had been the head of talent at a firm that rejected me 3 times, each time citing fit issues. Now she was asking if we were hiring in HR. Another had once taken credit for my proposal during a pitch, now asking if I needed a creative director. One of the resumes came from a man who had once told me, to my face, "You're good, but you're not quite what we're looking for." He had spelled my name wrong in the email. I read them all, carefully, slowly. I didn't feel what I thought I might. Not anger, not triumph, not even satisfaction. What I felt was stillness, like standing in the eye of a storm that had already passed. I sat with those resumes for days. I reread their cover letters, studied the words they used. Not because I was looking for reasons to turn them away, but because I was waiting to see if they'd mention me. If they remembered, if they understood what this moment was. Most didn't. They spoke of exciting new beginnings, of aligning values, of wanting to join a team making real impact. Some of them had clearly done their research, quoted lines from our mission, referenced our client roster, talked about belonging and inclusive ecosystems with the kind of practiced ease that comes from years of corporate PR. But I remembered every polite decline, every silent rejection, Every moment they had the chance to see me, and chose not to, and now here they were, asking me to see them. The irony wasn't lost on me. The kid they once said was too black to succeed was now in a position to decide their future. I talked it through with my leadership team. I told them the truth, told them what I knew, who these people were, what they had once represented in my story. One of my team members, a brilliant strategist who had grown up in housing projects and now managed six-figure campaigns, said, "You don't owe them anything." Another, a soft-spoken designer who'd been fired from her last job for cultural differences, asked gently, "But what kind of table are we building, though?" That question stayed with me, because that was always the point, wasn't it? To build a different kind of table. One where we didn't replicate the same silent punishments, the same closed-door judgments. One where dignity didn't have to be earned by performance, but granted by default. And yet, grace without accountability isn't justice. It's amnesia. So I called them in. Not all at once. One by one. Interviews. Just like the ones they'd led before. But now the table had turned. And the air in the room was different. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't cold. But I was clear. I asked them what they had learned in the years since we last crossed paths. I asked them what equity meant to them, not in theory but in practice. I asked them to tell me about a time they listened, not led. A time they realized they were wrong. A time they amplified someone else's voice without trying to narrate their struggle. Some answered honestly. Some deflected. Some clearly hadn't thought that far. One man, who had once told me, in a mentorship session, that people like me needed to prove ourselves twice as hard, sat across from me now with his hands folded, voice shaking just slightly. He looked me in the eye and said, "I didn't get it then. I do now. And I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. But it was something." Another candidate got defensive, said she didn't see how her past decisions were relevant, that she had a right to pursue new opportunities. She did. She absolutely did. But not here. When the interviews ended, I sat in my office and stared out at the city. The same skyline I once looked at from a bus stop, wondering how to get inside. And now I was inside. But more importantly, I was at the helm. That moment could have been about revenge. But I chose something else. I didn't hire all of them, but I hired some. Not because they earned it, but because we had. Because the table we built was not just for validation, it was for transformation. And sometimes transformation requires a kind of grace that doesn't forget, but forgives with conditions, with boundaries, with purpose. The ones we brought in were those who showed change. Not the kind you perform on social media, but the kind that seeps into how you speak, how you lead, how you listen. We watched, we tested, we waited, and they knew they were stepping into a place that remembered everything. This was no blank slate. This was holy ground. Not because of who we excluded, but because of what we endured to create the space in the first place. They walked into a culture that didn't belong to them, and were told with quiet clarity, if you're here, you adapt. We don't shrink anymore. We don't soften our voices to make the powerful more comfortable. We don't apologize for brilliance. We don't hide our scars. We lead with them. One day, after a team meeting, one of the new hires, a former manager who once ghosted my job application, stopped me in the hallway. He said, "I'm still learning, but thank you for letting me try." I looked at him and saw not a villain, but a man slowly laying down the armor of entitlement. And I thought, maybe this is what justice looks like, not just punishment, but participation. Still, I never forgot. Not the words, not the silences, not the doors that once stayed shut until I built my own. The interview table had turned. But more importantly, we had turned the system. And this was only the beginning. I could have said no. I could have stared at their resumes and deleted the emails. I could have walked into those interviews with my arms crossed and my heart closed. I could have let the silence they once handed me echo right back at them. Just as hollow, just as final. And no one would have blamed me. Not my team. Not my friends. Not the old version of me who stood outside office doors, wondering why his voice wasn't enough. Because justice, the kind the world teaches us, often looks like this: turn away, shut down, pay them back. But something in me, something deeper than ego and louder than memory, wouldn't let me do it. Because I remembered something they didn't. I remembered who I was when I sat across from them. Years ago, suit pressed, heart wide open, trying to smile through their doubt. I remembered how badly I had wanted to be seen, and I remembered how quickly they looked away. That version of me never got a second chance. Never got an apology. Never even got feedback. Just a nod, a thanks for coming, and a door that clicked quietly behind me. But now, I was the door. And what you do when you become the door, that's what defines you. So yes, I hired some of them. Not because they deserved it, but because I refused to become the very thing I fought to overcome. It wasn't about being better than them. It was about being different than the system that shaped them. It was about showing, not saying, that there is a power in grace that can't be manufactured, faked, or stolen. It's a kind of power that holds its head high, even when memory pulls you low. It's a power that says, I don't forget, but I don't return harm with harm, because I am not who you said I was. And that's precisely why I'm here. Still, don't mistake grace for naivety. I didn't hire them blindly. I didn't invite them in without clarity. I didn't build a sanctuary so the same kind of arrogance could sneak through the cracks and disguise itself as experience. We had standards, but not the ones they were used to. Here, we didn't ask for polished LinkedIns or 10 years of culture fit. We asked, what have you unlearned? What have you repaired? What do you now see that you once ignored? And more importantly, who did you become after the comfort of being right was taken from you? Some of them rose to the occasion. I watched one former executive, who had once dismissed me in a panel discussion, quietly take notes during a team meeting led by a 26-year-old queer strategist who had never been to college but had lived through things that no classroom could teach. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dominate. He just listened. And after the meeting, he said, "That was the clearest breakdown of impact design I've heard in 10 years. He meant it, and that mattered." Another hire, a woman who had once interviewed me and said I was a little too passionate, now worked in our community engagement division. She asked during onboarding if she could help rewrite some of our internal frameworks to center inclusive language. "I've got a lot to learn," she said, "but I want to help protect what you've built." Protect. Not correct. Not lead. Protect. She got it. And that was the threshold. Not perfection, not penance, but posture. Not everyone made it. Some couldn't handle the shift, the discomfort of being led by people who once would have never made it past their receptionist. One man made a passive comment during lunch about how our workplace culture felt a bit intense, which really just meant he wasn't used to being held accountable by women of color. He didn't last long, because this space wasn't built for their comfort. It was built for correction, not of who they were, but how they had been taught to lead, to take, to assume. Here, power wasn't inherited. It was earned in the silence between listening and speaking, in the willingness to say, "I was wrong," in the courage to say, "I never thought about it that way." And yet, even as I watched some of them grow, a part of me still wrestled. There were nights I sat alone at the office, long after everyone else had left, asking myself, why? Why not just build something clean? Why bring them in at all? And the answer came slowly, because building something clean in a dirty world isn't justice. It's avoidance. If I truly believed in the vision we wrote on the walls, the one about equity, access, transformation, then it couldn't just be for those who had been hurt. It had to include those who had done the hurting, and were finally ready to change, not to center them, but to redeem the spaces they once poisoned. Because redemption is never just for the wounded, it's for the willing. And I had become willing to hold tension, to extend conditional welcome, to say, "You're here now, but you move differently, or you move on." And that's the difference between vengeance and vision. Vengeance wants to see them suffer. Vision wants to see them wake up. And waking up isn't easy. It looks like a 52-year-old white man taking feedback from a 24-year-old non-binary project lead. It looks like a former VP Googling restorative leadership at midnight because he's never heard the term before. It looks like someone standing up during a team debrief and saying, I just want to name that I took up too much space in that meeting, and I'll be more aware next time. It looks like humility. And humility, I've learned, is louder than apology. It moves beyond regret and into reconstruction. So yes, I hired them. I hired them because I wanted to know what they do when the mirror was held up. I hired them because I didn't want our company to become an echo chamber of pain. I hired them because the same system that failed me also failed to teach them. And while that doesn't erase what they did or didn't do, it does give me a chance to model what real reparation can look like. Not through shame, but through structure. We built systems here that don't allow harm to grow in the dark. We don't just say, you're welcome here. We say, here's how we move. And you move with us or you move on. And the ones who stayed, the ones who adjusted, who asked better questions, who stayed late not to impress, but to understand, they became part of something holy. Because grace, when rightly held, does not excuse, transforms. I look back now not with smugness but with stillness. Because the truth is, I didn't hire them anyway. I hired them intentionally. Because this story isn't just about who doubted me. It's about who chose to grow when the doubt turned inward. And maybe that's the real revolution. Not the rise, but the restraint. Every now and then, when the office is quiet and the city outside has finally exhaled, I walk the halls alone. It's become a kind of ritual. I'll dim the lights, loosen my tie, if I wore one that day, and just walk past the framed mission statement we wrote in Sharpie on a sheet of poster board before we could afford design software. Past the gallery wall of client stories, each photo holding the weight of lives that look like mine, dreams that used to be dismissed as too niche, and solutions born out of struggle. Sometimes I end up in the small meeting room at the back, the one with the crooked blinds and mismatched chairs, the one where we signed our first big client, where we held our first team retreat, where someone once broke down in tears after saying, "This is the first place I've worked where I don't have to explain my existence." And I sit there, in the stillness, in the fullness, and I look back, not in nostalgia but in reverence. Because to look back now is to understand what we really built. Not a company, correction, a space that told the truth out loud, that held the stories the world tried to edit, that made room, not just at the table but at the head of it, for those who had spent years eating silence for dinner. This wasn't about me anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. It was about my mother, who taught me how to hold my tongue without ever losing my voice. It was about my father, who worked 2 jobs and came home tired but never small. It was about my grandfather, who scrubbed floors so I could walk across stages. It was about every teacher who saw me and didn't try to shrink me. It was about every kid who hears, "You're too much," and starts to believe it. It was about the ones who never got to sit in rooms like this, who never had the chance to turn their fire into structure. It was about us, all of us, and that's what legacy really is, isn't it? Not a name on a building, not a plaque in a hallway, but a door that stays open after you walk through it. And I think back to that hallway, the one where I first heard the whisper that started this all. "He's too black for the boardroom." It's strange how something so small can echo so long. But here's the thing they never expected: echoes don't just haunt. They shape, they travel, they multiply, they find new frequency in the hearts of those who refuse to be erased. And I became the echo of every rejection I ever received. Not in bitterness, but in blueprints. Every time someone said, "You're too loud," I designed a space where volume is sacred. Every time they said, "You don't belong," I wrote a policy that made belonging the default, not the reward. Every time they looked through me, I built walls made of windows, transparency as infrastructure. And every time I doubted myself, I remembered, this wasn't just my story. It was a continuation. Because Black legacy is never born in isolation. It's passed, whispered, protected, buried in songs, stitched into stories, encoded in rhythm and ritual and resilience. And what I was doing, sitting here in this office on this floor, was legacy work. It looked like budgets and timelines and grant reports, but it was sacred. And sometimes, I see glimpses of what that legacy will become. Like when one of our interns, a first-generation college student from the South Side, led a pitch meeting with a major client, and afterwards said, "I've never felt this kind of confidence before. Like I belonged before I proved anything." Or when our office manager, who once feared public speaking, gave a training to a room full of CEOs on trauma-informed leadership, and the room gave her a standing ovation. Or when a young man emailed us from a city I've never been to. He said he watched a panel we were on. Said he used to think people like him couldn't lead. Said he was starting his own thing. Said, "Thanks for showing me it's possible." That's legacy. Not what you build with your hands. What you awaken in others. And I know now I didn't just build a business. I built evidence. Evidence that our stories are not too heavy for boardrooms. That our brilliance is not too raw for strategy. That our struggle does not disqualify us. It qualifies us. Because the very things they told us to hide, our accents, our scars, our anger, our softness, our prayers, became the foundation for something that couldn't be undone by layoffs or rebrands or trends. Something that could only be passed forward. And I think of the day not too far from now when I'll step away from this chair. Not because I'm done, but because someone else will be ready. And when they ask, "How did you do it?" I won't talk about metrics. I'll tell them about memory. About holding on to what tried to break you until it becomes the thing that builds you. About looking back not to stay there but to understand the road. And I'll tell them what I know now. That success is not the opposite of pain. It's the product of what you do with it. That leadership is not dominance. It's stewardship. That forgiveness, when rooted in truth, is not weakness. It's liberation. And I'll tell them, without apology, that I was told I was too black to succeed. And I'll smile, because they'll be sitting in my chair. And I'll know, we didn't just survive the system, we outlived it.